stage I promised Father Ambrose, because I couldn't make it to the college then, that the next time I'm coming here, we'll do as many programs as we can together. Friends, we are, I think, at the moment at a very critical stage, as many stages have passed in the last 15 or 20 years, where we see we are at a very critical stage in our whole experiment at nation building, in our whole experiment with keeping a very diverse and plural nation together. There are several forces at work trying to disrupt the social harmony and social justice that very precariously exist, because there are depressed sections and deprived sections, our Adivasis, our Dalits, our minorities, who are trying to assert their rights and get equality. So we don't have a perfect sense of social justice yet, though we have the constitution. But we have the dream and the promise of equality, at least on paper. And I think what we really need to understand is that there are 2 or 3 major forces that are trying to actually wrest away even these constitutional safeguards that we have that enable us to fight for our rights. What are the greatest dangers in one sense that India faces today? Many of us believe, and I'm sure there are many in this room who agree, that one is kind of the pernicious and the direct forces of neoliberalization, which unfortunately are cross-party. So that's where the confusion comes in. Because the 2 major parties in this country seem to have adopted the same policies, appear to have adopted the same policies. So that's called economic right-wing, I call it. You know, pulling everything towards privatization, privatize education, privatize healthcare, don't have a sense of a welfare state, don't have a sense of distribution of wealth in sections that don't need it, don't recognize the contribution of the working masses to the production of this country and to the wealth that this country produces, and give extraordinary benefits to a corporatized sector. That is one major, major kind of danger that we face with the kind of policies we are pursuing. In the middle of this, when you have one judgment coming from the Supreme Court, like the Vedanta judgment, which came again around July this year, we recognize the rise of the Niyamgiri tribals to their culture and their place of worship in Odisha, and actually put a break on the pernicious practices of Vedanta as a company. There's a sign of hope. Some hope is there. People are launching their struggles everywhere. But the kind of bloodshed that Tatas are indulging in POSCO is a struggle only you and I will see when we want to go and look for the information on the internet. The media is blocking out these stories. The mainstream media is not telling us these stories. And those corporate houses, we were just discussing that, Tata's had an image of ethical governance. Those companies that were supposedly ethical are also adopting extremely regressive and repressive policies when there are protests over land, water, takeovers by the corporate companies. So one major danger we are facing is that, and that is a continued struggle. And according to me, the other major danger that we are facing, as always we've been facing for the last 20-25 years, it seems not much more dangerous today because of the person who embodies everything that the RSS stands for. Like Father Ambrose says, we're not talking about an individual here. We are talking about a force that he represents. We are not talking about a BJP candidate being put up for Prime Minister. We are talking about an RSS man being projected as Prime Minister. And we need to understand the distinction. That the backbone of the BJP, and why it is so distinctly different from other political parties, is a proto-fascist, Rashtriya Swayamsevak, that actually militates against the ideals of our constitution, that believes in superior and inferior notions of citizenship and nationhood, privileges the Hindu upper caste over other citizens, and also encourages violence to put people in their place. This has been the history, the history of the RSS. RSS has been implicated in several bouts of communal violence, Judicial Commission reports, etc. Which is not to say that minority communalism does not exist. I'd like to say that right in the beginning, personally, ideologically, in our magazine, in our endeavors. We've always said that majority and minority communalism, whichever be the minority, regressive tendencies happen within all faiths and religions. It doesn't happen only with the majority Hindu or the majority Muslim or the majority Christian or the majority Sinhala Buddhist. It is the problem of mixing religion with politics and the mixing of religion with state power that creates the problem. And if majoritarianism is more dangerous, it's simply because it starts influencing the functioning of the state apparatus. The functioning of the state apparatus tends to be influenced by majority communalism, not minority communalism. And therefore, quite apart from 2002 Gujarat, and we've been lucky for a variety of reasons to have ensured justice there. Kandhamal has not been so lucky. There have been hardly any convictions of 2008. You can see the brazenness of the BJP in actually fielding the same candidates who were named as perpetrators in Odisha. We've not been so successful in 1984, where the 6 were victims in Delhi, where there were kind of attempts at get reparation and justice still carries on. 92-93 Bombay, we've not been so lucky. But in Gujarat, because of a certain historical experience gained by some of us, we decided to fight the cases, to support the victims, get witness protection for the victim survivors from the Supreme Court, ensure that the Supreme Court monitors the trials, and because of a variety of these reasons together, we have managed to get 117 life imprisonments. That's a pretty awesome and historical achievement coming to communal violence, because it's never happened before in the history of this country. There should be justice in every case of violence, but unfortunately that has not been the case. We also feel very proud as a group that has assisted the survivors to have principally not asked for death penalty. And I want to say this before all of you, that those accused in the Godhra train burnings, 31 people were convicted, out of which 9 have been given death penalty. The state asked for it, SIT asked for it, and the court gave it. In all the post-Godhra reprisal killing cases that we have fought, and we have fought 68 such cases, which have resulted in 117 convictions, in writing we have put our written arguments saying we are arguing against the death penalty. Because we do not believe in a retributory form of justice, we do not believe in a reformatory form of justice. So even in the process of battling a very vindictive state, we have tried to also raise ethical questions for ourselves and our struggle as to what stand do you take. It's so easy to deteriorate into a demand for revenge and blood for blood. But we have tried to rise above that and done it. Coming back to the wider dilemma before us today, and it really is a dilemma, because the Right to Information Act has ensured that the entire misconduct of the UK too is in the public domain. The corruptions, the scams, the misgovernance, the lack of any initiatives, the lack of any measures has rendered a state of despair and confusion even among the supporters. Faced with that, we have the resurgence of the BJP under Modi, who believes that it will give us a new future and a new tomorrow. And in that situation, I think we need to understand what the forces behind the BJP represent and what it will mean for India and the neighborhood, not just India, but for the neighborhood to have a force like the BJP in power once again. The 5 years of NDA rule between 1999 and 2004 were very pernicious, were very dangerous. Not only did we have Gujarat and the genocide and the carnage, but I don't know how many of you remember, I addressed at least 200 meetings of Christians, brothers and sisters all over the country, which showed that as the BJP grew politically, as it increased its numbers from 2 to 189 and commanded a government under Vajpayee, the attacks on Christians across the length and the breadth of this country were legitimized and grew. Gujarat, Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh, I still remember the story of Sister Rani Maria. She was pulled out of a bus near Bhopal, outside of Bhopal, pulled out and killed in public view, and nobody intervened. I won't even talk about a shameful incident at Chhabua and what that meant. I'm not even talking about Kandhamal and Mangalore, I'm talking about long before that. So many attacks on the Christian community, and the attacks on the Christian community happen through the RSS, BJP, discreetly. They don't attack them the same way as they will attack the Muslim community, because the Muslim community lives in larger groups, but in the case of the Christian community, they attack the religious persons who are actually actually working in far-flung villages, doing social transformatory work, working with Adivasis, working with tribals. They target the individuals living there. So we need to understand that the forces of majoritarianism, which the BJP represents, the RSS as its backbone, have violently targeted different religious communities at different points of time. And we cannot afford to return to that state of affairs. I still recall what the Murli Manohar Joshi tried to do as the HRD minister. And I remember at that time 9 state chief ministers and education ministers walked out of the cave meeting when he tried to impose a Hindu curricular framework in that education. I don't know how many of you remember that. We need to remember these fundamental changes that the socio-religious right wing tries to make to take our democratic governance away from constitutional ideals towards the right wing path. And I think it's after years of struggle that we got our constitution. Our national movement was 150 years old. Every caste and community fought the colonial British. From indigo farmers to tribal, Birsu Munda, everybody fought this battle. And we fought this battle against the loot of this land. And now we are seeing a new kind of loot happening of our resources under neoliberal policies. The only difference I see between formations like the UPA and formations of the far right is that some space remains for negotiation and maneuver because they don't outrightly kill, blackmail, etc., though they might be completely compromised on the corruption front. So I think we are at a very critical juncture. There is despair, there is confusion. We need to understand what the forces combined, far economic right and the far religious right, if they come together to power, what this will mean for this country. In 2010, Outlook did a story, an investigative report, telling us that the makeover of Modi, the market makeover of Modi, from the mass murderer label to the development messiah, happened under the paid services of a company called APCO Worldwide. All of us here are thinking people access to computers and the internet. I invite you to look at the website of APCO Worldwide. APCO Worldwide is a lobbying company based in the United States with a extremely suspicious reputation. It works with dictators of Chile and Nigeria to transform their images. It works for arms manufacturers and works for Zionist groups. And therefore, I don't think it's a coincidence that a man like Modi chose APCO for his own makeover. My good friends Rohit Prajapati and Trupti Shah are firebrand activists who live in Baroda. You might have heard their names. They are doing amazing work at the grassroots level, and one of the things they try to do is to access information from the Gujarat government about the money it spends on whatever it does. Several RTI applications that they have made have resulted in no answers. One of the RTI applications they put in was to demand who pays the bills for the APCO bill, who pays the bill for the APCO account. Is it the taxpayer of Gujarat who pays the bill? Is it Adani, who is the supporter of Modi? Is it Ambani, or is it Tatas? They have not got an answer. And I think this is the lack of transparency in this kind of formation that needs to worry us as citizens. I mentioned the real danger that this country faces in terms of the cohesion between the economic right and the social and political right. And I'd say nothing describes this better. Nothing describes this better than how the corporatized electronic media is singularly backing one party and one candidate. It has never happened in the history of this country that no other political force is backed. No equitable time is given to other political parties. Forget the Congress and the UPA. Why is the BSP not given the same time? Why is Mayawati not given the same television coverage as Modi? Why is Nitish Kumar not given the same coverage? And it's a very dangerous reality that we are facing. That you have the fact that TV18 and CNN IAN and Times Now depend heavily on Ambani corporate support. We know that Adanis have invested heavily into NDTV. These are facts that all of us in the media business know. and this is influencing the way they put out news. I would invite all of you here to read a book written by Professor Atul Sood of the Jawaharlal Nehru University. It's on Gujarat's development with poverty, utilization and increase, he calls it. Very powerful book, where he brings out the pattern of development in Gujarat. And this is something that we need to understand. If, for instance, we make the mistake of adopting this model for the rest of India, then what are the parameters of this model? Quite apart from what happened in 2002, quite apart from the state-sponsored massacre, quite apart from the fact that he was Home Minister as well as Chief Minister when he allowed the reprisal killings to take place. Apart from some high capital density investment in Gujarat, what you have seen in terms of employment growth has been that Gujarat has actually reduced the number of jobs it is generating compared to Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu and Bihar. These other four states are actually marginally creating jobs, whereas Gujarat is actually creating less and less jobs every year. Among the jobs that it is creating, there is a 10% casualization of the labor that has taken place in Gujarat, which is that secure jobs have become insecure. And you have a very insecure job marketplace. So young people who are being openly led to this idea need to understand what this pattern of development might mean. If you go to the poverty development indicators, if you look at the whole issue of reduction of poverty, look at the issue of malnutrition, look at the issue of access to microcredit among Dalits, minorities and Adivasis in Gujarat, again you find an extremely discriminatory and disparate story. I don't want to bore you by reading statistics. You can access the statistics yourself. Already these are being contested in the public domain and the entire myth is being unraveled. But I just want to say that there is something about the way the statistics are being put out in a non-critical, non-dialogic format, which is not very healthy in a democracy. If one state wants to promote a particular mode of development and wants to argue that this is the best path for the rest of the country, it should have the moral courage to do so after getting into rigorous debate and dialogue with its worst critiques. If in fact it tries to blot out criticism, blunt out criticism, vilify critiques and malign critiques, then I think there's something wrong and something very authoritarian about this model of development. One of my most favorite stories, which nobody has really been able to answer, is the whole controversy around the Lok Ayukta in Gujarat. Somehow people have started believing that Modi is stealing. I don't know why. I mean, I don't know what. Is it the color of kurtas he wears? Is it the soap he uses? Is it the detergent he uses? I don't know. I really don't. Because I'm baffled. I'm baffled that here is a man who staunchly refused to appoint a Lok Ayukta, which is why the Anna movement captured our imaginations. Which is why Aam Aadmi Party is today going to fight in Delhi, though they don't have the guts to fight in Gujarat because they've been beaten out there. You know, this man who openly says, I will not have a Lok Ayukta, since 2003 he refuses to attack, despite the fact that the Controller Auditor General of Gujarat has said that there are scams worth 45,000 crores that need to be investigated in the state of Gujarat alone. I just named the scams. You can look this up independently on the CAG report. The Sufalam Sutralam scam, the KG Basin scam, the Narmada Canal scam, the health policy scam. All these scams have been documented by the Gujarat CAG report. It's not I'm saying it. It's not a private human rights group saying it. It's the same CAG through which we have debunked the UPA 2 that Gujarat government has been debunked. But these CAG reports don't find it to the national media. I don't find an Arnab Goswami waving a Gujarat CAG report at me on the noisy news hour and say, look at what Narendra Modi is doing. Because he is backing Narendra Modi. tooth and nail. And this is not objective, non-partisan journalism. I definitely feel that every scam of the UPA should be exposed. But I feel every scam of every government should be exposed. Why are you selectively exposing scams and keeping quiet on the scams of Narendra Modi? It's much better to say that we sell his detergent model or his soap. But you explain to me that when the Supreme Court said reinstate Justice Mehta as the Lok Ayukt, and the Gujarat government from 2011 to 2013, and this is Justice Mehta saying it, spent 45 crores of taxpayers' money on hiring the services of Harish Salve, Mukul Rohde and other lawyers to block the appointment of an independent Lok Ayukt. What is Modi so afraid of? If he is the messiah of clean governance as he makes himself out to be, he should allow his worst critics to examine the accounts. That is what ethical governance is about. But you use state power, you use public exchequer money to pay the bills for your private agenda, whether it's APCO, whether it's Lok Ayukta, and you still bandy the image of clean governance. It defies logic completely. So quite apart from getting to the development statistics, job statistics, how much access to microcredit and farmland or water do Dalits have Adivasis got any land under the amended Forest Act in Gujarat compared to other states? All these questions will give a very sorry story. But just ask yourself one question. Why no Lok Ayukt? Why no publicity to the CAG reports? Why are CAG reports not known to everybody? There was a very funny incident on 15th of August 2013 when a desperate bid to see himself as a fantasy prime minister, he addressed the nation from a school in Kutch. But one of the things he said that was frightening. And I want to bring that to the notice of this audience because the RSS in power at the center, an RSS man in power at the center, is also dangerous for what it will mean for our neighborhood. He made a completely irresponsible statement when he demanded that the peace agreement signed between India and Bangladesh on BSF filings should be cancelled. Now you can't have a hysterical, megalomaniac, majoritarian leader sitting in Delhi when you have such a volatile neighborhood and India and Pakistan highly militarized states. I'll give you a little bit of background here. Between 2000 and 2003, there were 2,000 killings by the BSF of innocent Bangladeshis who used to keep crossing over as they keep coming to India for employment. After much difficulty and negotiation, an agreement was signed between the two countries to prevent such firings from taking place. And what does Modi do? Says, remove this agreement. I mean, is this the way a responsible, mature leader of a leading opposition party should be talking? We are a large country, we are a powerful country, we have a volatile neighborhood. Yes, we should be clear about tackling terrorism, but we should also do it responsibly. We cannot afford war, we cannot afford nuclearized war, and we must understand that. Can a megalomaniac person be trusted with those decisions when he's so desperate to woo votes in a hegemonic fashion? I quote from Shekhar Gupta of the Indian Express when he said, the BJP is proving to be an irresponsible opposition party because it's blocking the Teesta Rivers Agreement. Pranab Mukherjee is pushing it, the government is pushing it. We have a government in Bangladesh which is secular that has banned the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is the flip side of the RSS, and instead of supporting such a secular government, BJP in a self-serving way is blocking the agreement simply so that it scores brownie points. And what will happen in Bangladesh? She will go back to her people in December. The Prime Minister will go back, unsuccessful to have signed this water agreement, probably get defeated, and you'll have an Islamist regime back in power. And that's exactly what the BJP wants. That's exactly what the RSS wants. They want extremists to rule on both sides. They don't want sober, inclusive governance. So we have to understand that the dangers of this hegemonic majoritarian politics does not lie, as Father Ambrose said, in only one individual. It lies in an entire ideology and force that is desperately backing this individual as their best chance ever. Somehow they feel that if they don't make it this time, they may not make it again. And that is the turning that is going on in India. It's a huge challenge before all of us, wherever we are. Parents, teachers, students, social workers, activists. To just bring people alive to who are the forces that are trying to dominate India and who are challenging our constitutional base and our republican base and values. What does the RSS have to say about the Indian tricolor? It has contempt for the Indian tricolor. L.K. Advani, who now everybody is seeing as a moderate messiah, I don't know how you can do that when here is a man who divided this country, whose bloody Rath Yatra, I don't mean it in a swear form, I mean bloody, B-L-O-O-D-Y, as in spilling blood. Between 1986 and 1990 resulted in bloodshed wherever he went, in his movement to demolish the mosque and to gain popularity for that movement. Advani commented on why should the Indian flag have the Ashok Dhamma Chakra. I mean, this is their complete abhorrence of pluralism and diversity. They don't want our flag to be pluralistic and multicultural. They want it to represent only one color, and that is why the RSS headquarters in Delhi has only a saffron flag. It has never ever flown the tricolor. Because the tricolor with the Dhamma Chakra in the middle symbolizes the different sections of the Indian people and the contribution of different sections to Indian nationhood. And that's another thing we need to understand. Why is the RSS and why is the BJP? Because the BJP is the parliamentary wing of the RSS. It's nothing else. Why are they a danger to the Indian Republic and the Indian Constitution? That's the question we need to address. In between 1946 and 47, we had a very tragic vivisection of this subcontinent. 500,000 lives were lost. 800,000 displaced. Which were the forces responsible for it? If you only look at our textbooks, we myopically tell ourselves that it was only Muslim League and Muhammad Ali Jinnah that were responsible. To get a mature reading of history, we must understand that while Muslim League and Muhammad Ali Jinnah must share the blame also 50% rests with the Hindu Mahasabha and the Rashtriya Swayamsevak. If the Muslim League dreamt of a nationhood only for Muslims, because they believe that Muslims were not safe with any other community, then Veer Savarkar, V.D. Savarkar and the RSS Golwalkar also believed that the only way Indian nation should or could be defined was as a Hindutva-driven nation where Hindu citizenship was supreme. Both have to share the historical blame for the vivisection of this land. And let's not forget that our founding mothers and fathers, who deliberated for 18 long months in the Constituent Assembly debates. In fact, you had one draft of the Constitution before the partition, and you had another draft of the Constitution after. So the process was going on even before and went through and after. If India had to become a Hindu Rashtra, what better time could there have been is the question I want to ask young people today. We had bloodshed in the name of religion. We had bloodshed where three communities equally suffered, Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims. The Hindus suffered in the Delhi and Bengal, Muslims suffered in Bihar and Sikhs in Punjab. No community suffered less and no community suffered more. Brutalities were equal and atrocious on all sides. We have to only read Krishna Chandra and Sadat Hasan Manto if we want the facts. What better time for India to have become a Hindu Rashtra than 1947? But no. Despite the chasms and the schisms caused by the vivisection, our founding mothers and fathers made a very reasoned, pragmatic and principled choice. We chose to give ourselves a constitution on 26th of January 1950, and we chose to found our ideas of the constitution on Articles 14 to Articles 30. I don't want to repeat those, but the preamble says it very clearly. 3 lines, 4 lines. Justice, social, economic, political, and equality of opportunity, of life and opportunity. Did that mean that India became equal? Did that mean that we became suddenly a society without any discrimination? Ask any manual scavenger and he'll laugh in your face. Ask an Adivasi or a Dalit and they'll scoff at it. But ask the vast majority of the people of the country what that constitution means to them, and they will say that it is the dream and the promise of reality and the dream and promise of equality that that constitution means. You take that away. You take that away and replace it with Hindutva or Islamization or a Sinhala Buddhist kind of Sri Lankan constitution, and you will find the dream of egalitarian and discrimination vanishing, and this country will find it very, very difficult to stay one and united. It was a pragmatic and principled decision that our founding fathers and mothers took. And it is this vision, this republicanism, this constitution that is in real danger. The forces of authoritarianism, the forces of the far economic right and the social religious right want to come together in a manner in which to squeeze and to repress any opposition and allow all our resources to be completely plundered by the corporatized world. It's a real threat. It's a real threat to democracy. I don't even want to go into the horrors of what the Christian community went through between 1998 and 2004, how many lives were lost, or the pogrom of 2002, or the fact that while it is true that except 1984, where the Congress was directly involved in the violence against the Sikhs, the Congress may have been in power, or other parties might have been in power when violence took place, but the perpetrators of violence were always the Hindu right wing, whether it is 1969 Ahmedabad, whether it is Jabalpur 1961, whether it is Ranchi 1969, whether it is Meerut Maryana, where the PAC, the UP Provincial Armed Constabulary, shot dead 51 Muslim boys in cold blood and dumped their bodies in the river, or Bhagalpur 1987, where in little villages you found that Muslims were massacred overnight with a VHP on a rumor mongering and hate mongering scheme. The perpetrators have always been from the extremist majority and Hindu right wing. The compromise the so-called secular parties have made is allowing the culture of impunity and not punishing them for their ills. And that is why they are also a compromised political force. But we need to understand this distinction. I cannot end before speaking for a few minutes about Muzaffar, because we've just seen that violence happen. And I appeal to each one of you who's active on the internet, who's active on social media, please be proactive against the kind of hatred that is being generated on the social media and the internet. It is very, very dangerous. I know proponents of freedom rightly talk about the abolition of 66A, and we must talk about that because of the kind of repressive actions and short-sighted actions that state police takes. But let's not forget that there are laws in this country against hate speech and hate writing. And today the internet and the social media are the biggest generators of hate speech and hate writing. And the speed with which a hate piece goes viral just takes the click of a button in a few seconds. So how is that connected to Muzaffar? This afternoon, just as I was coming here, I got an email. I got an email because I had the fortune or the misfortune also of being on the mailing list of RSS people and also of the Islamic right. They all feel that they can convert you at some point, I guess. Or they want to use it as a threat or whatever. But I like to keep myself informed. So I got an email from one such source of the Hindu right wing which says, please visit this YouTube and you will get the entire speech made by the BSP MLA Kadir Rana, who has said in the Friday prayers meeting that took place on, I think it was August 31st, I think that was a Friday, 31st or whatever, after the Friday prayers, where he supposed purportedly, I have not had a chance to see the YouTube, but where it's purported to have said that no Hindu child will be allowed to survive in Muzaffarnagar. This is what the blurb said. I was shocked when I read this, for the obvious reasons. We know about the hate speech in Muzaffarnagar. The national television channels have been showing it to us, bleeping out the objectionable words for the last 3 weeks. So we know that not just Kadir Rana, but also Suresh Rana of the BJP and Sadhvi Prachi of the BJP have equally been uttering hate speeches. But I'm wondering why this India Today YouTube that comes to me today has got the full version of what Kadir Rana says, and it's gone viral on the internet today, when it's a clear violation of the law. In the next 6 months, this kind of polarization is going to be used to garner support for the majoritarian BJP. I'm making this very reasoned statement, and therefore I'm making this appeal that the challenge to each one of us today is to save India from this disaster. In Muzaffarnagar, Baghpat, Shamli and Meerut, 4 districts that were racked by violence, where about 60 people were massacred. There have been some rapes as well, and 42,000 people were rendered homeless in relief camps. The violence had been brewing for several months before it spilled. Pernicious stories called love jihad were being circulated, where it was being said that Muslim boys are abducting Hindu girls, raping them, etc. A group of people, responsible citizens, sat with this list of Muslim boys that was put out on the internet and cross-checked across newspapers for the same time period and found that yes, while these offences had taken place, where it happened to be that the rapist or the molester was Muslim, in the same period, there were as many or more incidents where Hindu boys were molesters and rapists, which had been conveniently and selectively left out of the narration. What happens with this?